By the spring of 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was disintegrating faster than anyone could have imagined. All across the ruins of Germany, fires burned where once stood proud cities. Soviet artillery thundered from the east, their shells crashing into Berlin's outskirts. To the west, the Americans and British swept across the Rhine, encountering little more than scattered pockets of resistance. What remained of Hitler's empire was a map of desperation. Isolated, broken, and terrified. In the forests of Silesia, far from Berlin's dying heartbeat, a different kind of operation unfolded. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about hiding. Deep within the labyrinth of tunnels, mines, and railways near the town of Wałbrzych, SS officers gathered under the cover of darkness. They were not soldiers preparing for battle, but custodians of stolen wealth, gold, jewels, art, and valuables taken from across occupied Europe. The order was clear. Move the treasure before the Soviets arrive. The Red Army was known for taking what it found, and what the Reich had plundered over 6 long years could not fall into communist hands. So began one of the most secretive and desperate undertakings of the war's final days. Witnesses would later recall the haunting sight of a train being loaded under tight SS guard. Heavy crates marked with swastikas, stamped with seals from the Reichsbank. Each box represented the spoils of a continent. Gold bars from Austria, art from the Netherlands, jewelry seized from Jewish families. Every treasure that could be carried was packed into the dark wagons. The locomotive itself was armoured, its steel hull blackened to blend with the night. Locals whispered of the ghost train, a moving fortress of stolen riches. As the Allies closed in from both sides, the train's departure was shrouded in secrecy. SS Major Jakob Schwerg, known for his ruthlessness, oversaw the final preparations. He ordered that no civilian workers survive who had seen the loading. Within hours, several were executed near the tracks, an act meant to silence the truth before it could ever be told. On a misty morning in early May 1945, as Germany's surrender loomed, the locomotive screamed to life. Its wheels ground against the rails, pushing the treasure-laden train into the mountains. Few who watched it go would ever see it, or its cargo again. The war was ending, but for this train, a new journey was just beginning. A journey into legend and into the shadows of history. From the first days of occupation, plunder was policy. Behind the Wehrmacht's columns came officials with clipboards and sealed orders. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Reichsbank's agents, the SS economic officers. Museums were emptied under the pretense of protective custody. Bank vaults were opened by soldiers with lists. If a key could not be found, a charge of explosives would do. Europe's wealth, its gold reserves, its crown jewels of art, its private savings, was mapped, categorized, and stripped away. The machinery of theft was efficient. In Paris, trains departed for Germany loaded with paintings and sculpture. In the Netherlands, Jewish families were forced to list valuables down to wedding rings and silver spoons. In Poland, where occupation was brutal from the outset, the extraction was total. Factories were dismantled and shipped east. Church icons disappeared. The holdings of banks and individuals were converted into bullion and funneled toward Berlin. Everywhere the same logic. Wealth equals power, and power must flow to the Reich. The Reichsbank became the beating heart of the operation. In its vaults, gold melted into identical bars, stripped of provenance. Stamped eagles replaced the origins of coins from Prague, Vienna, Brussels, and Athens. Stored beside this bullion were foreign currencies, diamonds, and the most portable items of value: watches, jewelry, and gold dental fillings taken from concentration camp victims. The bank's ledgers transformed individual lives into anonymous numbers. The human cost was recorded only in weight. As Allied bombing intensified, the regime dispersed its treasures. Reserve caches were sent to mines, castles, and tunnels, the deep places of Europe. They called these dispersals Auslagerung, external storage, an antiseptic word for a dirty business. At the same time, the SS looked to the future. If the war were lost, what could be saved? What could buy a second life in exile? Who would be paid, bribed, or silenced? The answer was always the same: gold moves with you. By early 1945, a second map existed in the shadows, a map of hiding places: salt mines in Thuringia and Bavaria, tunnel complexes in the Sudetes, castle cellars in Bohemia, and in Silesia, under a mountain range riven with shafts and galleries, a special route was being prepared. The Nazi state, built on theft, would try to disappear its stolen heart into the earth. They never called it by one name, but survivors used a phrase: a safe haven for gold. In late 1944 and early 1945, as the Eastern Front shredded divisions, SS economic planners convened quiet meetings. The agenda was not imaginary victory, it was continuity: how to push wealth beyond the Red Army's reach. The plan depended on three pillars: secrecy, mobility, and local fear. Secrecy began with compartmentalization. Only a handful of officers knew the full cargo or destination. Railwaymen were told to prepare special transports. Police units received orders to secure stations without asking questions. Civilian miners, pressed into service, were given numbers, not names, and reminded that silence would keep their families safe. Some never returned home at all. Mobility meant trains, trucks bogged down on ruined roads. Aircraft were scarce and targeted. Rail lines, still the arteries of Germany, could move hundreds of tons at night, darkened and guarded. Silesia's rail web, fed by junctions near Breslau and Görlitz, made it ideal. There, in the shadows of the Aal Mountains, the regime had been carving a secret: Project Riese, a lattice of tunnels driven into stone. Whether meant for command bunkers or factories, Riese offered something priceless in collapse: depth and confusion. Fear was the final ingredient. Word spread that looters would be shot, that witnesses disappeared. SS Major Jakob Schwerg, or men like him, signed transport orders, requisitioned locomotives, and directed detachments to sweep villages clear of prying eyes. The treasure was packed in standard crates and military chests, labeled with bland codes, protected by armed guards who saluted no one but their own. In the last weeks, documents were burned, manifests broken apart, responsibility diffused. The goal was not elegant accountancy, it was plausible deniability. If a train were found, no one could prove what was aboard or who commanded it. If a tunnel were discovered, it would be one of many, and if the men were captured, they would have only fragments to confess. 1,000 small shadows to hide one great one. The night the train moved, the sky was low and wet, swallowing sound. A locomotive with an armored nose rolled into a siding, its lamps hooded, steam ghosting in the rain. Guards paced with machine pistols, boots splashing in the black puddles. Inside the wagons, crates were stacked to the roof, lashed down with straps that creaked like rigging on a ship. A clerk, young, exhausted, ticked boxes on a list that would be ash by morning. Witnesses remembered the smell: oil, wet wood, coal smoke. They remembered the rhythm of a heavy train taking weight, the couplings knocking like distant drums. When the whistle finally hissed, it was less a signal than a last breath. The train drew out of the yard and took the line toward the mountains. At small stations, signals changed without explanation. Switchmen who asked questions were told the train carried ammunition. In truth, ammunition would have been simpler and less guarded. Patrols rode the roofs. A flat car near the front held sandbags and a mounted gun. In the caboose, an SS officer studied a map, then folded it, then studied it again, as though the paper might shift beneath his fingers. The route wound past slag heaps and black forests. Tunnels breathed cold air. Galleries throbbed with the sound of passage. Somewhere near Waalbrich, the train left the main line and crept onto a military spur. The mountains closed in. A long tunnel ahead was rumoured to connect to deeper works, unfinished, irregular, branching like roots. The train entered and did not emerge on the far side, at least not for those waiting to see it. Men posted at the western portal swore they heard shunting inside, the peculiar metallic shrieks when wagons are uncoupled. Then, hours later, the concussion of a blast rolled out of the earth, and dust like old snow drifted from the mouth of the tunnel. By dawn, the portal was a scar of fresh rock and timbers. The line beyond? Gone. The mountain had eaten a train. When the Red Army arrived, they found a landscape of deliberate confusion. Maps missing, records burned, locals terrified. But Soviet counterintelligence, SMERSH, was not easily deterred. They interviewed station masters at gunpoint, searched depots, tore up siding, and sent miners back into holes they had abandoned days before. Rumors ran faster than orders. A Nazi gold train, a tunnel sealed with explosives, a cache that could ransom a state. Engineers brought compressors and drills. In the Owl Mountains, they opened galleries and found barracks, storage rooms, poured concrete corridors, a subterranean city interrupted by collapse. In chambers lit by carbide lamps, they discovered crates of documents, machine parts, spools of cable, but not the avalanche of gold the whispers promised. In some shafts, meters of rubble choked the way, as if the mountain had been persuaded to swallow its secrets whole. Soviet officers requisitioned what they did find: art stacked against walls, crates marked with museum stamps, industrial equipment wrapped in oilcloth. Trucks rolled east loaded with spoils both warlike and cultural. Meanwhile, interrogators sought the men who had ordered the trains. Some were dead. Others had vanished in the refugee flood. A few talked, pointing to locations that yielded little. It was like chasing a shadow cast by a torch that kept moving. Reports flowed to Moscow, some meticulous, others fantastical. One memo claimed that an entire armored train had been buried and electrified to kill intruders. Another suggested a diversion, that the real cargo had been split, moved west, and quietly surrendered to the Americans in exchange for leniency. The files grew thick. The mountain remained blunt and silent. The Americans had their own lists, their own hunters, their own reasons. As US forces swept into Bavaria and Thuringia, they uncovered troves in places like the Merkers salt mine, vaults of gold and currency, and art stacked like firewood in galleries of salt. The discovery energized Allied monuments officers and finance teams. It also convinced intelligence units that more caches must exist. Signals traffic mentioned special trains in Silesia. Field reports talk around their contents. A few after-action notes hint that SS officers used the treasure as leverage. information, access, escape. In the chaos of May 1945, the boundaries between recovery, justice, and expediency blurred. If a man could provide a map, perhaps he could postpone a reckoning. If he could deliver a vault, perhaps he could reinvent himself. Here the theories begin. One holds that a portion of the Silesian treasure was quietly recovered by US units far from reporters' cameras, then laundered through the fog of denazification and early Cold War priorities. Another claims that what the Soviets didn't find, the locals did, piecemeal over years, with shovels rather than headlines. Skeptics argue that the train never carried as much as legend suggests, that the story grew in the telling because people prefer a vanished fortune to a prosaic ledger error. What is certain is this: both superpowers had incentives to keep successes quiet and failures quieter. Returning stolen wealth was good politics. Keeping some of it was convenient. Files were classified, then reclassified. Witnesses aged. Memory hardened into rumor, and rumor into certainty, depending on who was speaking. In the first post-war winters, silence settled heavier than snow. Villagers near the tunnels learned to speak around the subject. A shrug, a gesture toward the hills, a joke that landed without laughter. Men who had worked the rails kept their heads down. Some wore new uniforms and new names. Under occupation and then under the People's Republic, curiosity was a risky habit. Occasionally, a thaw. A hunter found a length of rail under moss. Children stumbled on a bunker mouth and ran home with a helmet. The state sent surveyors, then ceased to ask questions in public. The archives ate paper by the kilometer. In families, stories survived as sharp little fragments. Grandfather's night shift when the tracks were cleared for a mysterious convoy. An aunt who saw trucks at 3 a.m. A cousin who went to work at a new site and never returned. For those who had loaded the wagons, guilt and fear braided together. Some confessed to priests, others drank away the edges. A few wrote letters that were never mailed. If executions occurred to seal the secret, and many believe they did, the bodies lay where dynamite made graves quickly. The border shifted, flags changed, and the mountain remained exactly itself, indifferent to the living. 7 decades later, the legend roared back to life. In 2015, 2 treasure hunters announced they had located the Nazi gold train near kilometer marker 65 on the line between Wrocław and Wałbrzych. Their claim electrified the world. Television crews arrived. The internet filled with diagrams of tunnels and speculation about armored wagons. Local authorities negotiated, historians argued, and engineers rolled ground-penetrating radar across embankments gone to seed. The scans returned anomalies, dense shapes, long and regular, suggestive enough to feed 1,000 headlines. Excavators arrived with careful choreography. First the topsoil, then cautious trenching, then a pause for safety checks. Weeks passed under summer sun and camera glare. What emerged was Earth. Compacted, ancient, stubborn Earth. The anomalies were geological, the experts said. Underground formations masquerading as machines. Not everyone believed the verdict. Some argued that the trench had simply missed the target, that the train lay meters away, or deeper, or in a parallel spur no longer on maps. Others insisted the entire story was a grift, a tourism gambit that nonetheless boosted the local economy. Meanwhile, smaller finds continued. Caches of pistols, a crate of documents, a sealed room with rusted parts. Enough to sustain belief, not enough to end the story. The search moved from fields to forums to courtrooms. Permits, property rights, national heritage laws, and the ethics of excavation turned adventure into bureaucracy. The legend adjusted, as legends do, shedding skin and growing new ones. The mountain waited. What matters most may not be whether a single train sleeps behind a wall of blown rock, but the truths the legend points toward. War is a furnace that melts value and virtue alike. Men who began as bureaucrats became thieves. Soldiers became porters of other people's lives. Theft scaled into policy and then into a world view. In the accounts of empire, the entries resolve to wait. The gold train endures because it offers a perfect parable. The moment when a regime built on plunder tried to save its soul by burying its sins. Even if no armored wagons sit in some Silesian dark, the story is real in another sense. The museums cataloguing returned art know it. The families who never recovered a grandmother's ring know it. The miners who heard explosions in a mountain at dawn know it. Perhaps someday a drill will find an unexpected void. Perhaps a collapse will open a gallery and the light of a headlamp will fall on stenciled crates. Or perhaps the mountain will keep its secret until it is no longer interesting to the living. Either way, the rails run still in memory, vanishing into stone. The whistle that once sounded there has faded, but the echo remains, an invitation to remember not just a treasure, but the cost of the world from which it was taken. In the decades that followed the war, Europe rebuilt itself over the buried bones of its past. Cities rose again, factories hummed, and nations tried to draw lines between guilt and survival. Yet beneath the concrete of new railways and the calm order of post-war life, the gold train's legend refused to die. It lived in rumor, in the quiet obsession of men who could not let go of the idea that somewhere under the mountains, the Reich's last breath waited to be unearthed. In the 1960s, Polish engineers exploring for minerals found passages that ended in reinforced walls. They recorded odd readings and unexplained voids. Some whispered that they had found a tomb of treasure. Others said it was only an unfinished branch of the Riese complex. Still, the files were sealed and marked state security interest. For decades, the public heard nothing. Western intelligence occasionally took notice. During the Cold War, American and British analysts speculated about the Nazi caches as possible funding sources for fugitive networks, the so-called Odessa trails. Journalists who probed too deeply into the gold train found their sources drying up or redirecting them toward other mysteries. The truth, it seemed, had been buried under layers of both rock and politics. Meanwhile, the people of Lower Silesia lived above history. Children grew up playing among derelict bunkers, never knowing that beneath their feet might lie the plunder of half a continent. To them, the legend was simply a story to tell when the wind moaned through the tunnels. But to treasure hunters and historians alike, it remained unfinished business, a symbol of the war's unresolved greed. And so the gold train endures, not as an artifact of steel and gold, but as an echo, a reminder that even when empires fall, their shadows linger. Every rumor rekindled, every excavation begun anew, keeps the mountain alive in the world's imagination. Perhaps the true treasure is not the gold that may rest beneath, but the lesson above it. That power built on theft always buries itself, sooner or later, under the weight of its own lies.